How Legends Are Born, August 1997. Tires have a way of always going flat when it's raining. Engines won't turn over, and brakes don't function, and fuel gauges always lie when it's raining. It may not be the case for anyone else, but for Mike it was universally true, especially after sunset. It was the first rule of travel for him. The front passenger's tire had fulfilled that rule with perfection. The rain saturated his hair and had begun to work its way down his neck like icy fingers as he stood on the roadside deliberating his options. He could pull the jack out of the trunk and change the tire himself, or he could get back into the car and call the number on his insurance app and wait for someone to come and change it for him. He glanced up and down the unmarked blacktop. It was walled in on both sides by a thick mat of old-growth trees that sprung out of an undergrowth of thorny brambles, twisted vines, and poisonous plants, all of which sat, he was sure, on a carpet of leaf matter and rotting branches. In some places the forest came up to the edge of the road and formed a canopy over it. In others it withdrew a dozen feet or more to reveal small patches of tall grass. He had pulled his car to a shaky halt at a point where a grass oasis was ending, but where the trees had not yet moved forward enough to form the canopy. He shrugged. It didn't matter. There was room to work, whether it was him or some other guy. His flashlight had a base that allowed him to set it on the end so it could act as a lantern. He had a set of road flares, but he didn't see the need for them. He'd been driving this road for the past hour and hadn't seen a single vehicle. The only houses he had passed looked abandoned. If it weren't for the power lines overhead, he would have assumed that this road led to nowhere, despite the fact that his GPS assured him that he was headed in the right direction. Ultimately, he decided that he could have the tire changed and be on his way long before anyone would be able to reach him. He walked back to the truck and pressed the open button on his key fob. It took some manipulating to remove the jack from its position on top of the spare. Then it took a little more elbow grease to withdraw the donut from the wheel. Great! A donut! A gust of wind pushed the rain hard into his face. He looked down the road again, hoping against hope that someone would happen along. Even if they didn't change the tire for him, the company would be nice. He had a sudden need to know that he was not the only human left on the face of the earth. There were no headlights cutting through the driving rain. He turned to look back up the other direction. A bolt of lightning split the sky open with a loud crack. The light momentarily turned the world from black to deep shades of green and gray, and for a second, for less than that, the dark outline of a figure stood out on the edge of the trees where the road turned and disappeared around the bend. Mike caught his breath in shock. Who would be out walking in this weather? Who would be out here this late? He looked down at his watch to confirm that it was well after 10 p.m. The digital face read 11:43 p.m. And his eyes squinted as he tried to focus on the spot where the figure had been. But it was too dark. Shaking his head, he told himself that he had imagined it. Maybe it was a tree that only looked human. He sighed again, and he was getting tired of hearing himself do that, and he picked up the jack and carried it and the tire up the side of the car. Then, realizing that he had left the lug wrench in the trunk, he started back to get it. Another lightning bolt lit up the night, and he turned quickly, hoping to see that same figure and identify it as a tree or a road sign. He wasn't quick enough. Grabbing the tire iron, he moved back up to the front passenger quarter panel, and he knelt down, turning the flashlight up on its base and sitting it on the ground beside him as he did so. He put that figure out of his mind. There was a tire to be changed. He hadn't done this himself in quite some time. He had to think about where to place the jack. Then he had to let the jack back down because he had forgotten to loosen the lug nuts first. A few minutes later, he was crawling around on the ground trying to find the lug nut that he had lost when it fell off before he was ready. And he held the lantern high, hoping that it would reflect off the nut when he heard the growl. Stopping, his eyes went immediately to the trees 7 feet away from him. black on black, looked back at him. It was so dark, raining so hard, that he could barely make out more than deep shadows on top of deeper shadows. Anyone, anything, could be lurking only feet away, and he wouldn't know it. Panic swept over him. He hadn't removed all the lug nuts yet, much less the tire. It would take time to put the other tire on. He would have to turn his back on the woods to do so. He thought for a minute that he could get in the car and lock the doors and wait until daylight. That would be the safest thing to do. With a little effort, he managed to get up on his feet. Yes, he would get in the car and wait until daylight, at least until the blasted rain stopped. His hand reached out to feel for the car behind him while his eyes continued to scan the tree line for the source of the growl. Blindly, he let his hand lead him around to the front. He backed off the shoulder onto the road and worked his way clumsily to the driver's side. And behind him, from the other side of the road, he heard a loud snap. Someone was stepping on a twig. The relief of not being alone spread across his face in the form of a smile, even as he turned to see who was back there. A set of eyes stared through sheets of driving rain at him, glowing from some internal light. He looked up at them, gauging their height to be somewhere around 7 or 8 feet off the ground. This was not a human being. This was an animal, and lightning struck, and in the strobing light he saw it. It wasn't an animal. This was a monster. Mike let out a cry of alarm. His hand groped for the car door, wrenching it open, and he spun around and tried to dive inside. He felt the claws tear through the skin on his back, and he felt the blood flowing down his spine, and he felt the first bite, then the second. He knew he was being consumed. He knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. It was 10 a.m. the next morning when the squad car pulled up behind the abandoned car. The officer called in the out-of-state plates and took the relevant information before getting out to investigate. He was silently grateful that the rain had passed and the sun was shining. Daylight was infinitely better than a dark, stormy night, especially when it came to these Mississippi backroads. He made his way up the passenger side of the car to look at the jack and tires on the ground, and he turned and looked at the trees behind him, wondering if perhaps the owner of the vehicle had wandered into the woods to relieve himself. A cold shiver traced his spine, feeding the goosebumps that blossomed on his arms. He knew he was being watched. His eyes scanned the entire tree line, and nothing moved. No sounds emerged from the vegetation, no animals scurrying, no insects chirping, no birds singing. For several seconds he stood in anticipation of something that he couldn't quite explain. Something was beyond his line of sight. Something was going to burst from the trees at any moment, and his hand slid to his holster. He released a long breath and then inhaled slowly and deeply. It was coming, and mentally he ran through his training, preparing himself for something. In a sudden explosion of sound, the cicadas erupted into a wall of song that nearly knocked him off his feet. His knees gave way to the shock, and he fell back against the side of the car. A bird flew overhead and landed in a tree and began to sing. And somewhere a squirrel was barking. Something crashed through the undergrowth deep inside the forest. It was moving away from him. The world had slipped into and then out of a trance. It was over. Several deep breaths later, the officer's heart began to beat at a slower pace, and he resumed his investigation. He turned around and looked into the passenger's window. The back seat held a tote full of small boxes and brochures. A suit hung from the hook over the door. Traveling salesman. He noted a wallet tucked into a cup holder between the seats, but the passenger's door was locked, so he moved around to the other side. His hand touched something sticky on the door handle, and he pulled it back to investigate. His fingers had a dark gelatinous substance on them, and he thought it resembled a mashed earthworm at first. Putting his fingers to his nose, he smelled it. A sickly, metallic scent assailed his nostrils. He knew instantly what it was. And placing one hand on his gun and looking around, he reached up with the other and pressed the button on the mic clipped to his shoulder strap. "Dispatch, we have a situation." April 1999. Prom was a blast. It was held at the country club, the inside of which most of the graduating class had rarely seen. Strapless and brilliantly colored prom dresses glittered in sequined accents, and black tuxedos boasted cummerbunds to match their date's attire. Gauzy yellow clouds of fabric dotted with rhinestones were draped over the walls of blue material in celebration of the theme, Starry Night. The air was choked with the scent of patchouli and musk, with centrist undernotes and grocery store corsages. Tacky as it was for the teenage girls in attendance, it was paradise, and for the boys it was a promise of paradise they would find later that night. Gareth was not an athletic kid. His grades were a solid C, and he worked part-time at the local McDonald's, at which he made just enough money to put gas in his truck and pay for the constant repairs that the nearly 15-year-old vehicle was always in need of. He had already applied for and been offered a job on the grounds maintenance staff at the university, something that allowed his father to quip, "Our boy's going to college," to anyone who would listen. Most of them didn't get the joke. Courtney was Gareth's co-worker at McDonald's. She was saving her money to pay for classes at the community college where she planned to join the nursing program. She was much more interested in a career as a hairstylist, but her mother was a nurse's aide, and she dreamed of her daughter taking the next step up the ladder, and Courtney didn't want to let her mother down. The two went on their first date shortly before Christmas break, and by Valentine's Day she was wearing his class ring. He proposed during spring break and she accepted. They planned to marry shortly after she received her associate in nursing. Their parents smiled knowingly and said silent prayers of gratitude that their children had at least the good sense to wait. Courtney wore a black sequin gown similar to that worn by Rachel Lee Cook in She's All That. Most of the girls had chosen dresses reminiscent of that movie. None of them looked as good in them as the actresses whose bodies were fully mature at the time of filming, and Courtney was no exception. Gareth was happy that she had chosen black. It meant he could dress more like his hero, James Bond. As they walked off the dance floor, having danced to "I Don't Want to Miss a Thing" by Aerosmith every time the DJ had played it, Gareth took Courtney's hand and drew her through the door and out the foyer. "Let's get out of here," he whispered as he leaned in to kiss her neck. "We can't," she protested. She wanted to leave too, but she didn't want to seem rude with her friends. "I'm tired, let's go," Gareth insisted. Courtney looked over her shoulder at the dance floor. It was much less crowded than it had been earlier. They wouldn't be the first to leave, and they certainly didn't want to be the last. "Okay, let me go in and grab my purse and say goodbye." Gareth pulled a small black velvet clutch out of his pocket. Courtney looked down at it and giggled. When he purchased it, she had thought she'd be lucky to get her lipstick and a comb in it. Now she was glad that she'd chosen the small bag. She looked up at Gareth with a dazzling smile and nodded her head. They rushed out the door like a pair of inmates making a prison break. Gareth was pulling his truck onto a small gravel drive that led down to the lake. They hoped it would be vacant. The little parking spot at the end of the road wasn't big enough to accommodate more than a couple of vehicles. Anyone who parked there would leave their running lights on so anyone else could see them in time to turn around at the one wide spot in the road. And as they approached that point, they both heaved a sigh of relief. It was vacant. Most of the kids could be crowding into the local hotel that night. Someone would get a room and 6 other couples would join them. There would be no privacy, a lot of underage drinking, and an eventual call to the cops. Gareth and Courtney, as an engaged couple, saw themselves as being above all that. Besides, it would be the popular kids. Keaton Evers and Jetta Davies would be there with their court in tow, and neither Gareth nor Courtney would be welcome. Well, this spot was much nicer. The moon was full and the sky was clear and the water was smooth as glass. The radio drowned out the strange silence around them. They pulled up to the water's edge and turned off the truck. Gareth knew the battery would be dead if he left the truck running lights on, so he decided to chance it and go completely dark. They got out and Courtney walked down to the water while Gareth pulled a blanket out from behind the driver's seat. He went to the back of the truck and dropped the tailgate. He opened the cooler that he'd stowed back there earlier and pulled out a couple of Bacardi Breezers. "Hey," he called, holding one for Courtney. She turned and exclaimed, "Where did you get those?" as she walked over to take the one he was offering. "I took 'em from Dad's refrigerator out in the garage. He won't miss 'em. He only keeps 'em around for when Mom decides to come out and have a drink with him." He slid up to the tailgate and added, "Which is never." Courtney tilted hers up to take a long drink, but had to stop short when it dribbled down her chin onto her dress. "Damn it," she said. Gareth chuckled as if he were much older and a much more experienced drinker before doing the same. "Shit," he wiped the droplets of red fluid away from his white shirt. Courtney, too shy and polite to insult her boyfriend with outright laughter, turned her attention to the surrounding woods. "It's quiet out here tonight, isn't it?" "It's too early for the bugs," Gareth said. "But still, it's quiet." They sat quietly for a few minutes, and Gareth finished his first drink and reached for another, but Courtney had barely touched hers. "Gareth, it feels weird out here," she complained. 18-year-old boys, no matter how much they might think otherwise, do not hold their liquor well, nor do they understand the importance of pacing themselves. Gareth swallowed the second bottle in one long gulp before tossing it into the woods. "Don't be stupid," he said. "We're all alone. You're not used to being alone, that's all." Courtney was not convinced. She surveyed the edges of the little clearing with wide, frightened eyes. "It doesn't feel alone," she said after a few minutes. "It feels like someone's watching us." "No one's watching us, Court," he told her, sitting down the third bottle that he had already consumed half of. "We're as alone as it gets." "Did you hear about that guy whose car they found out on Route 7? She asked. "That's just a myth," Gareth said dismissively. "A story they tell to scare kiddies." "No, it isn't," Courtney countered. "My dad's cousin was married to the cop that found the car." "What I mean is the story about the guy's a myth," Gareth argued. "I know they found the car, but they never found him. He probably got tired of trying to change the tire in the rain and walked away from it." Courtney considered this before saying, "I know something that the public doesn't know." She waited for Gareth to take the bait, and when he finally turned and looked at her as if to say, "What?" she said, "My dad's cousin told my dad that they found," and she paused to find the right words. They found body tissue on the side of the car." Gareth's eyes widened for a minute. He stared at Courtney while trying to determine if she was lying or telling the truth. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he thought she was being honest, but his thoughts were being processed through 3 alcoholic beverages. He mentally argued that police officers don't share information like that even with their spouses. He had seen enough CSI to know that cops don't talk, period. "Hey," he said in a soft, mildly slurred voice. "I brought a blanket." His hand reached behind him to feel around. "Let's lay down." Courtney wanted to say, "No, let's leave," but she was suddenly aware that Gareth was no longer in any condition to drive. And with a sigh, she accepted that lying down was a better option than driving headlong into another vehicle and dying. She took the blanket and stood up in the bed of the truck to spread it out. She didn't see the eyes watching them from a mere 12 feet away. Gareth staggered to his feet and turned around to watch Courtney for a moment before the sudden urge to relieve himself sent him into the bushes. He caught his foot on a clump of vines as he stepped inside the tree line that sent him sprawling forward onto his hands and knees. The thorns of a wild rose pierced the palms of his hands and the fabric of his pants ripped. His stomach, already struggling with the amount of alcohol that he had consumed, lurched and expelled its contents. "Gareth," Courtney called, "are you all right?" Yeah, he answered, not bothering to hide his disgust. I just tripped. Well, it sounds like you're sick, she said. He opened his mouth to deny that he had just vomited, but a low growl stopped him. His head shot up, and he looked all around him. What was that? He muttered. What? Courtney asked. Gareth didn't answer. He was looking frantically around him, trying to find the source of the strange growl. It wasn't a growl, really. It was something between a hiss and a rumble, and he couldn't think of any animal that could make a sound like that. Gareth? Courtney couldn't hide the concern in her voice. She stood up and stared in the direction Gareth had gone. It was too dark to see anything beyond the clearing, and the shadows beyond the trees swallowed that little light the moon provided. Gareth! She yelled. Panic was setting in even before she caught sight of the eyes. 3 sets of them stared back at her. The tallest pair, a good 7 feet off the ground, blinked slowly. Courtney felt every muscle in her body tense and then convulse. She opened her mouth to scream. She needed to tell Gareth that he was surrounded by something, to warn him, but shock had sucked the air out of her lungs, and all she managed was an odd sort of huff. And then something flew out of the tree line and hit the side of the truck with a loud thump. Cautiously, she leaned forward and looked over the edge of the truck to see what it was. Gareth's head stared up at her, his eyes wide, his mouth open, in a scream that he was not given time to vocalize. Courtney screamed then, too. Long, agonizing wails of terror echoed across the lake as 3 hair-covered bipedal beasts stepped out of the woods and advanced on her. In the last second, when it was already too late, she turned and tried to run, and then they pounced. An hour later, 2 other young prom-going couples made their way down to the gravel road to the lake. They didn't see headlights when they reached the turnaround point, so they continued on. The truck parked on the beach surprised them. Common courtesy dictated that they quietly back their vehicle out and leave the first to arrive alone. But teenagers never think in terms of courtesy. Wouldn't it be fun to sneak up on the unknown couple with their flashlights and surprise them? Wouldn't it be fun to see the shocked looks on their faces when they caught them making out, or worse? They'd all have a great laugh watching the unsuspecting couple scurrying to right themselves. It would serve them right for not leaving their running lights on. It wasn't fun, no one laughed, and all 4 of them would spend years in counseling to help them accept and understand the scene that greeted them that night. November 2007. Eli had hunted the woods around the family farm since he was a kid. There had always been stories of boogers and werewolves, but he never believed them. It was all BS in his book. There ain't no monsters out here, he would tell those foolish enough to broach the subject. If there were, I'd have seen 'em by now. He insisted that he had hunted every square foot of that land that belonged to his family and most of the woods on the surrounding farms. But every now and then, someone would come along and claim they had seen something that didn't make sense. They'd tell stories of being chased out by something too big to be a human, but clearly on 2 feet. Some of them were hikers and kids playing around the woods. Eli figured they weren't country folks, so they probably didn't know the difference between a squirrel and a bobcat. Once in a while, it was a hunter who made those claims. To them, Eli always asked, "Why didn't you shoot it? You had a gun." He enjoyed making fun of those yahoos, a bunch of scaredy cats with big imaginations and little common sense. "That's all fine and good for them," he would tell anyone who would listen. "Leaves more room for me to hunt." There were a few times when he heard things that he couldn't identify. A couple of times he felt like someone was watching him. Once he found himself walking a little faster because he felt like he was being followed. But he was alone when that happened, so no one ever knew about it. He certainly wasn't going to tell anyone. And then, last week, he came to check his deer stand, and it was knocked down and torn apart. At first, he thought it was another hunter who thought he didn't have permission to be on his land. He was pretty mad about that. He told himself he'd catch up with that guy who did it and he's going to tear him up. That was before he noticed the claw marks on the tree. Eli tried to run his fingers along the marks, but they were further apart than he could spread his fingers. It gave him a cold chill. There were no bears in the area. Hadn't been in decades, centuries maybe. The marks were far enough up the tree that he had to climb up to reach them. No dog or coyote could get up that high. He supposed it could have been a bobcat, assuming bobcats got as big as tigers. He didn't have an answer for that. By the time Eli got home, he had convinced himself that the marks were left behind as some sort of practical joke by some SOB who tore down his stand. He figured someone knew he had a prime location and they wanted to scare him off. Well, it wasn't going to work. He had to make a special trip halfway across the state on Saturday to get a new stand, but he'd be damned if he was going to let some so-and-so run him out of his favorite spot. And while he was there, he picked up a trail cam. It took him half the night, but he figured out how to use it, and the next time someone came along and tried to tear up his stuff, he'd know exactly who it was. Sunday morning, sleep-deprived and ill-tempered, Eli pulled up to the gate and parked his truck. It would be a 15-minute walk in, and he was tired as hell. Deer season opened the following weekend, though, so he didn't have a choice. He couldn't miss work, and there wasn't enough daylight after work to drive out and do it during the week. And before he could get to the trees, he'd have to cross a pasture, and after that, he'd have to cross a narrow stream. Even when it rained, the water was never more than shin deep, and it hadn't rained in weeks. Then he worked his way into the woods, and that was the hard part. He had to follow a game trail that was lined with briars. He wasn't 100 yards in when he began to feel like he was being watched. And after what happened to his tree stand, he was sure it must be the same son of a bitch who was now watching him now. He thought about raising his hand up high and flipping them the bird, but he couldn't quite tell what direction they were watching from. He didn't want to look like an idiot. Another 50 yards, and he thought he heard a twig snap. Is it deer? He stopped and looked around. It looked like something moved, but it disappeared behind a tree before he got a good look at it. He was hoping it'd be a big 10-point buck, or maybe it was that irregular he caught sight of a couple of weeks ago. He was 25 yards from the tree where he planned to put the stand when he heard the first howl. He stopped dead in his tracks. What the hell? He ran through a mental list of animal calls. None matched it. He had taken only a few steps when the second howl sounded, closer this time. Again he stopped and ran through the possibilities. He couldn't come up with a match. Feeling more than a little easy now, he glanced around him and mumbled something about nobody chasing him out of these woods. He'd been hunting here for too long. This was his turf. This is my turf, he yelled, and he moved on. 10 more yards and the sound of something moving off to his left brought his head around with a snap. This time he got a little more than a glimpse. Like a sleepy child, he rubbed his eyes, unable to comprehend what he had seen. It wasn't a deer. It was moving on 2 legs, but it was too big to be a man. Turning to look back in the direction he was moving, he saw another one, and it too was standing on 2 legs, and it was standing directly in his path. In the early morning mist, it was difficult to make out any real detail, but he was sure that he was either looking at the tallest man he had ever seen wearing a heavy fur coat, or he was seeing Eli wasn't the kind of man to admit, even to himself, that he was afraid. He knew the tree he was headed for was closer than his truck, but he also knew that thing was standing between him and his tree. Before he could turn and head back to the truck, though, he had to convince himself that it wasn't because he was scared. Maybe he forgot a tool. He didn't check his bag before he left. Maybe he left it sitting on the bench at home. That was it. He may as well walk back out and do this later. Slowly he turned and began to retrace his path, and it followed. He knew it followed because it wasn't bothering to be quiet about it, and worse yet, it was moving faster than he was. It wouldn't be long before it caught up with him. He stepped up his pace, and his heart was beating hard now, and his breath was coming in short bursts. He felt his hands sweating inside his gloves, the stand feeling heavier by the minute. It was getting closer. "Don't run," he whispered to himself. "Don't run, don't run, do not run." He broke into a run. It wasn't a conscious decision to drop the stand. One minute it was in his hand and the next it wasn't. The thing behind him was closing the gap. He was sure he could feel its hot breath on the back of his neck, and he jumped the stream and ran out into the pasture. Halfway across, he realized he didn't hear it anymore. He stopped and turned to look. It wasn't there. He bent over a little and put his hands on his knees. He needed to catch his breath and slow his heart rate. And after a few seconds, he allowed himself to look back at the tree line. It looked like it always had. No giant hairy monsters in sight, and a laugh escaped him between his breaths. And then it built into an all-out laugh. "Eli, you're the biggest idiot on the planet," he said out loud, "and you got a good imagination." With the kind of steely determination only a fool can muster, he stood upright and marched right back into those woods. He'd paid $300 for that tree stand, and by God, he wasn't going to let it lay out there in the woods and rot. As he worked his way back down to the creek, he realized that he could hear birds singing. It was odd. Couldn't remember hearing birds earlier. A squirrel ran up a tree barking. He hadn't heard any squirrels before either. Maybe he had seen something, but if the birds and the squirrels were moving around and making noise, it was a sure sign that whatever it was gone now. He had walked the trail for 2 hours from the pasture to the tree 3 times. He hadn't located the lost stand yet. The trail cam was in his backpack, which was still on his back, but the tree stand had vanished. He wished he could remember exactly where he had dropped it. It's funny how fear can make a man do things he can't remember. He was frustrated and he screamed out several loud expletives. Angry and feeling more tired than ever, he gave up. The only thing left to do was to go round up his buddy Roy and bring him out to help him search for it. His stomach was growling and his feet were starting to hurt. He put his head down and he started the long walk back to his truck. On the way back, he thought about the events of the morning and he wondered what he had seen, if he had even seen anything. He tried his best to remember if he had heard the birds and the animals in on the first trip. And as a hunter, surely he would have noticed their silence. Silence. Cold fear twisted a knot in his stomach when he realized that it was silent now. "You just yelled, dummy," he told himself. "You probably scared everything off." That had to be it. It wouldn't hurt to walk a little faster, though, just in case. He could hear the babbling water of the stream ahead of him. It wouldn't be long now. The pasture was on the other side of it, and his truck was on the other side of that. He'd go home and have a good hot meal, maybe watch a little Sunday football, and take a nap in his recliner. He had to put this all behind him. He was starting to sound like those scaredy cats down at the cafe, for Pete's sake. Eli hadn't been paying much attention. He was too tired and too furious and too frustrated to use the wilderness skills that he had spent a lifetime honing. There was no telling how long that thing had been standing in the path ahead of him. He looked up and it was just there. It was closer now than it had been before. It had the head of a dog. Insanely, it had the head of a dog. His eyes were unlike any eyes he'd ever seen on any dog, wolf, or even a coyote. They could have been human or they could have been animal, but in them he saw intelligence and hatred. Now what was he going to do? It blocked his path to the truck. Behind him was nothing but woodland all the way to the river, 5 miles away. He looked to his left, thinking maybe he could go around it, but to his horror, another creature stood a dozen yards away from him. Had it always been there? He turned to make his escape to the right, but another stepped out from behind a tree there. And as he spun around to run in the only direction left, he came face to face with the biggest one of all. This one was on all fours, and clearly it was stalking him. With a yelp, he backed up a step. He was surrounded, and they closed in on him with a slow, measured movement. Something in their actions told him they were enjoying this. It was almost as if they were smiling. "They're real," Eli cried. "I can't believe they're real." They were the last words he would ever speak. When is a story just a story? Is a fool the one who believes without solid evidence, or the one who became a believer at the cost of his own life? They say there is some truth in all legends, no matter how far-fetched they may be. Some legends have a little more truth than others.